Hello and welcome back to Canada, a story of evolution.
In this episode, we'll continue to follow the Johnstone family, this time out of the Great Depression and into the Second World War.
To understand the causes of World War II, we first must look all the way back to 1918, at the end of the First World War.
The end of the war was made official when several countries signed what is known as the Treaty of Versailles.
This treaty outlined the peace conditions and heavily punished Germany. Germany was forced to surrender territory, pay millions of British pounds in recompense, and admit to causing the war. It also forced peace for 20 years.
Fast forward 15 years, and many Germans are still very resentful of how they were treated. One of these Germans was named Adolf Hitler, and as the end of the 20-year period fast approached, he rallied the German people.
Through the 1930s, Germany began to go against many parts of the treaty by amassing forces and retaking territory, and countries such as Britain and France responded by amassing their own armies.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, rapidly taking territory. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Second World War began.
To help us better understand the war, we will look at the stories of various Canadians who lived through the war.
The first thing we will look at is the Battle of Hong Kong. In December of 1941, Japanese forces invaded British Hong Kong in an attempt to capture the city. We go now to a soldier who fought in the battle.
The Battle of Hong Kong. The first time us Canadians saw action on the battlefield, and some action it was. It all started on the 8th of December 1941. The Japanese Empire raided the British Crown colony of Hong Kong. The odds were against us. We had limited training, and we were outnumbered. The Japanese later won the higher ground on the hill, and they dominated the air. And we were bombarded by a heavy rain of explosives constantly, an apocalypse, yet we fought valiantly. This battle was bloody. We literally fought to the last man down, and many of us were killed and some were imprisoned. I was one of the POWs, prisoners of war, and experienced the harsh captivity of the Japanese. Even before the battle had officially ended, Canadians would endure great hardship at the hands of their Japanese captors. Many did not survive. In all, more than 550 of the 1,975 Canadians who sailed from Vancouver in October 1941 never returned. I always will remember the anxiety we experienced. Our eyes open wide day and night, with alertness so strong and weapons tightly clenched, with our fingers on the trigger. We were so restless that a gentle wind would make us go off. Worst of all, having the thought of never returning to my worried family while awaiting news of my well-being, and thinking how would they react if I never returned.
7 months later, in August 1942, 5,000 Canadians attempted to raid the French harbor of Dieppe. It ended up being a total disaster, and we now go to a soldier who was there to help us understand why.
Came up to Dieppe at almost 5:30 in the morning. Chaos. Dark. A couple smoke grenades going off to cover us. Landed. Able to get out of our boats. Then, machine guns. Bullets whizzing past everybody's faces. Took out a lot of us. Mortars coming down, blowing our ears out. Machine guns. Terrible. Doomed from the moment it started. POW captured. It's not very good. Total casualties of Dieppe, about 3,000 over that. 900 dead, 1,800 captured, 600 wounded.
Despite its horrors, the war was a great time for technology and innovations. One of these new technologies were advanced warplanes, which were showcased in the largest air battle of the war, the Battle of Britain.
I was sitting in my chair listening to the radio when this broadcast came on saying that the Germans proposed to invade London. At the time, one of my sons was in London, and I just remember feeling so afraid, just hoping he was okay. This just in from the front lines. The date is July 10th, 1940, and the German forces have just launched a full-fledged assault against the United Kingdom. By the end of it, my son was back home, finally put to rest. Some families didn't even get a body to bury at all.
One of the most famous days of the war was known as D-Day, when a massive force of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in an attempt to retake territory from France. We go now to one of those soldiers, a Canadian who landed on Juno Beach.
The landing crafts were little more than a steel shell with a motor on the back. You could feel every wave and hear the shells exploding all around the craft. When we finally got to the beach and the door opened up, I was shocked. Not only were the German defenses still intact, but the other landing crafts had gotten spread out, and it was just us and the German pillbox further up the beach. When I finally got out the door, there were bodies everywhere, floating, lifeless in the blood-soaked water. We were told not to help any of the wounded, and I had to do just that. It's hard trying to focus with men screaming at you, help them, knowing that if you don't help them, they're going to die. We had landed 14,000 men at Juno. 340 were killed, 574 were wounded, and 47 were taken prisoner. At the end of the day, we'd advance further than the Americans or the British had on their beaches.
During the Battle of Normandy, I landed on the beach with a M4 Sherman medium battle tank. My job was to support the infantry as we pushed through the country all the way up to Germany. You don't realize what it's like when you're stuck with 4 people in a tank for hours upon end. And the only light of day you see is when you see the burning tanks in front of you. During the Battle of Bastogne, I had to stand up and kill hundreds of German soldiers as they were firing through on my M1919 Browning heavy machine gun. I'll never forget seeing so many comrades die that day.
Later that year, a large group of Canadians took part in another amphibious operation called the Battle of the Scheldt. It involved clearing the banks of the River Scheldt, which lay in German-controlled territory of Belgium and the Netherlands.
The battle ended just before winter, which was when we needed the supplies most. 6,000 of us hurt or injured. That's what I've heard. 2,000 or so of them dead. The place is flooded with water, potentially over our heads, but for that we had the amphibious vehicles to get across. One man I talked to a bit, his name was Bert. He got sniped in the leg and fell into a mine. He was the only one I saw to get hit by a mine. For that I'm glad, because it was gruesome. I'm extremely glad it's over though. It felt like you were freezing as you moved out into battle, and you never knew if you were going to get shot by somebody you hadn't seen, or blown up by mortar from behind the enemy lines. But knowing the extent of what we completed, it feels amazing to have done it. Now, I'm just content to go home to my wife.
As well as airplanes, new battleships were also prevalent in the war. In the Battle of the Atlantics, Allies fought off German ships in an effort to keep the supply lines open.
The town looked a lot different than how I remembered it. There was a dull, constant humming in the air that I later learned was from the planes flying overhead. The station was absolutely full with trains, and the noise was deafening. They told me how after the men left, word got back to them about how merchant ships were being sunk by the German U-boats. We were losing men by the hundreds, and ships weren't making it to their destinations. There was no quiet time anymore, and the air was always full of smoke. They told me I needed to look for work wherever I could find it. I spent hours every day unloading heavy trains full of boxes of ammo and supplies. You had to move quickly because blocking these doors was frowned upon, and the other workers were not gentle if you stood in their way. We would run them down to the docks and load them quickly and neatly into boats. I became good with working with my hands, and when a damaged ship came into the docks, I was the first to offer to patch it up. One day, my father-in-law gave me a telescope that he told me he wanted to give to Jeremy when he was ready, but that I could have it until then. I used it to watch out over the water, and eventually I saw one of our merchant ships go out into the water and be shot down by German U-boats. I watched it sink, and I decided that I wanted to be a nurse in the town, helping the few soldiers that did return from the water. I did not want to help send people to what I thought was an almost certain death any longer.
Coming into the end of the war, the Allies began a long process of whittling down the German people until their eventual surrender. Much of this weakening was done in the form of bombing campaigns, and many Canadians were in the planes.
I remember the night of the attack. It was 2200 hours. We flew over Dresden in our Lancaster. My plane was part of the main bomber force called the Plate Rack. It looked down at the city below. Firestorms and incendiaries lit up the night. We were hovering over a group of large factories when the pilot gave me the signal to drop the bombs. My hand hovered over the lever as I remembered living through the Blitz, the very incident that had inspired me to join the Air Force. I looked down at the city again, and I asked myself, is it really right to put these people through the horrors that I experienced that day? But then I remembered my friend collapsing to the ground and burning to ashes right in front of me, and tears filled my eyes, and I grabbed the lever and I pulled hard.
Now that we've talked about some of the battles, let's look at Canadian life back at home. Just like the First World War, women played a very important role in the war effort, working hard to support their troops and their country.
At home, things resembled World War I for the women. They took over work in the factories just like they did the first time around. However, this time everything was driven towards the war. Everyday jobs were tweaked to better help the war. Women would knit clothing like socks and mittens, assemble care packages, and write letters to soldiers. Many women gave up their luxuries and even some necessities to help. The silk that would have been used for their pantyhose was made into parachutes, and some women even began painting their legs and drawing on the seam. Women donated silverware and metal drives for war material production. I had the option of serving in the war, however, I chose to stay at home. I donated all of our silverware, which were collected by some children going door to door. I couldn't wear pantyhose because the silk was needed overseas, so I was one of those women who just painted them on. I also had to plan our family's meals carefully because food was being rationed. There were days when I didn't eat anywhere near enough just to make sure that my children had plenty. It was tough, but things got better. Rather than just supporting from home like in the previous war, the Second World War saw, for the first time, women in uniform. Women got jobs as nurses, in the Navy, and even in the Air Force.
My experience in the war differs from most women I know. I was not at home taking care of the kids. I was not working in a factory to provide for my family. I was only 25, I didn't have any kids, my husband was overseas, and the only person I had to provide for was me. So what better thing to do than to go overseas myself? That is why I joined the Women's Division of the Air Force. I wasn't fighting or anything. The RCF WD was a non-combat division of the military. My jobs included the basics, cooking and cleaning. Those were the only responsibilities deemed suitable for women. I didn't mind though. It was better than being stuck at home alone. I felt like I was contributing anyhow. If I wasn't doing the cleaning, then a soldier who could have been fighting would have been. That was our main role as women in the Air Force. We serve that men may fly. That was our motto. That wasn't a bad deal for us. We could contribute to our country without being in the dangers of war. More soldiers were needed, and we stepped up to fill their spots as laboratory assistants and mechanics. That's what I became, a mechanic. It wasn't so much the involvement that interested me, it was the uniform. I couldn't wait to get out of the dresses and jacket they had me in and put on some work clothes. That was the thing with mechanics, you could be wearing overalls and no one would judge you. As a mechanic, I repaired planes and trucks. It was a never-ending cycle of repairing and sending out to combat. It became a competition between me and some other girls to see how fast we could fix up a plane and send it on its way. I always won. I had a knack for welding, so I could patch up planes in no time.
In the months following D-Day, Allied troops pushed eastward through France and towards Germany. Many Canadians were part of this push and helped liberate Belgium, France, and the Netherlands.
Things were looking good for the Allies, but Germany did not back down. It wasn't until 11 months after D-Day, on May 8, 1945, that Germany finally surrendered.
To force Japan's surrender, the Americans used the first ever atomic bomb, which devastated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The Second World War was the most devastating and destructive war in history, and will always be remembered as such.
We can only hope that by studying this history we will not be doomed to repeat it.
But that's all the time we have for now.